In this episode of Drive Through History, we are going to look at life in colonial Boston. We'll explore how the American continent was radically changed as a few small colonies in the early 1600s grew to 4 million people by the time of the American Revolution. We will scour Boston and the surrounding area for its rich history. This is the birthplace of liberty, where the shot heard round the world started a war that created our nation, and in the process created a world-changing idea. A government that obtains its power from the consent of the people and recognizes basic human rights, not as a concession reluctantly granted from some king, but as a gift given to every human being from God. We will take a tour through famous battle sites, climb the steeple of the Old North Church, and look out the window made famous by Paul Revere's legendary ride. We will learn how and where the war got started and see firsthand those famous places you read about in history class. Places like Lexington, Concord, Bunker Hill. And we will take this tour in what I like to call the Drive Through History Mobile Adventure Vehicle. I'm your host, Dave Stotts. Buckle up and let's ride. The road starts in Boston. In the last Drive Through History, we explored the lives of the Mayflower Pilgrims who founded the Plymouth Colony about 40 miles from Boston. It was a different group of English Puritans who, 10 years later, founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony here in Boston on September 17, 1630. The Massachusetts Bay Colony's first governor, John Winthrop, captured the idea that the city of Boston had a special covenant with God, giving the famous City on a Hill sermon entitled A Model of Christian Charity. These stout Puritans built Boston on stable, well-structured Puritan ethics, and even founded America's first public school and our first college, Harvard. Winthrop was the leader of the colony as a result of the Cambridge Agreement, made in August of 1629. This agreement guaranteed the Massachusetts Bay Colony would be under local control, answerable only to the king, not a corporate board back in London. But their loyalty to the King of England would erode over the next 140 years. Bostonians led and initiated the American Revolution, primarily due to oppressive and unjust taxation by the crown. In the minds of increasingly angry American colonists, there was a word for such taxation without representation: theft, and it threatened to undermine their economy. So, by the 1770s, Boston was tense, a powder keg ready to explode. After the 1770 Boston Massacre, which resulted in the death of 5 American civilians at the hands of British soldiers, and the famous Boston Tea Party, the brave act of protest by American colonists, war was brewing on the horizon, with local colonial militias being organized, and British troops under the leadership of Thomas Gage ordered to suppress open rebellion among colonists using all necessary force. The stage was set for the American colonists to defend themselves, believing, as Ben Franklin once said, rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God. It is perhaps fitting, then, that our first stop in Boston is a church. Well, we're almost to the Old North Church here in Boston, of the one if by land, two if by sea fame. Now, it's also known officially as the Christ Church here in Boston. Built back in 1723, it was Boston's oldest church building. Now, on the evening of April 18th, 1775, this church played a significant role in the American Revolution. Well, here we are. Let's go take a look inside. The British General Thomas Gage was a parishioner at the Old North Church. The general was also appointed governor of Massachusetts by King George. He figured a good way to keep peace between the Tories and the Whigs would be to confiscate any weapons owned by the colonists. So General Gage devised a plan to seize the weapons and ammunition from the Minutemen at Lexington and Concord. His idea was to send British soldiers across the Charles River and march the remaining 15 miles under cover of darkness. That way, the soldiers would arrive at sunrise, collect the armaments kept there, and be back in Boston before the townspeople could organize a resistance. This was to take place on April 18, 1775.
Now, unfortunately for the good General Gage, he had a leaky house, so to speak. Now, rumor has it that it was either his maid or his American-born wife, Margaret, who informed the leaders of the Sons of Liberty of General Gage's secret plan. Now, most of the people who attended Old North Church were loyal to the crown. Fortunately, the guy with the keys wasn't one of them.
Paul Revere and the Sons of Liberty were ready. They had developed an intelligence network, a sort of 1775 version of the CIA. Revere was planning to ride on horseback to Lexington, but he wasn't alone. There was a sophisticated and well-planned system for alerting the Patriots to action. Revere knew the sexton of the Old North Church, a man named Robert Newman, who was a colonial sympathizer, and asked him to send a backup signal to warn the Patriots in Charlestown in case he was captured on his ride.
Well, I'm making the ascent up the steeple of the Old North Church. Now, if you're afraid of confined spaces or heights, you may want to just hang out in the gift shop. Now, the original steeple was 191 feet tall, the tallest building in the entire city of Boston, making it the logical place for a signaling tower. Now, on that fateful night, around 10 o'clock, Robert Newman climbed these steps to signal the Patriots in Charleston that the British regulars were on the move. Newman probably only kept his 2 lanterns lit for less than a minute, but it was long enough to alert the riders Paul Revere and Richard Dawes. But unfortunately, it was also long enough for the British to get the message, too. It's ironic, isn't it, that from General Gage's own church, from the King's own church, that the lanterns that sparked the American Revolution shined so brightly on that fateful night. Now, Newman had wisely locked the doors behind him, but before he could make it down the steeple steps, the British regulars were pounding at the doors to investigate. But Newman escaped by running down the aisle of the church and jumping out of this window. It's called the Newman window in his honor, even though it's really not a window anymore.
The 2 riders, William Dawes and Paul Revere, were ready to ride. They headed toward Lexington and Concord, extending the warning to a network of patriots as they rode. By the end of the night, over 40 riders had galloped into action. Of those 40 riders, it was Paul Revere that became the most famous, primarily because of the good PR he got from a poem written much later by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. There were 3 big reasons for Paul Revere's ride. Revere wanted to alert the population that the British Army, or regulars, were on the move and to get ready to defend themselves. He wanted to warn the colonists to protect the arms, ammunition, and supplies that were hidden away in Concord. And lastly, Revere needed to warn 2 fugitives, John Hancock and Samuel Adams, 2 future founding fathers and signers of the Declaration of Independence, that the British were coming to arrest them for treason. The home where these 2 giants of American history were hiding out was the next stop on my journey. Now, this house is magnificently preserved, and it's known today as the Hancock Clark House. And if you ever visit Lexington, Massachusetts, you've got to check it out.
Behind me, on this busy street here in Lexington, Massachusetts, is a fine example of an early American New England home. But more importantly, this home has served a pivotal role in the founding of this great nation. And in 1744, a young 7-year-old orphan boy named John Hancock came here to live with his grandfather. His Uncle Thomas, who owned a shipbuilding business, would later adopt John. He was sent to Harvard, where he earned a business degree at age 17. In fact, John was so trustworthy and so capable that in 1760 he was sent to England on a business trip. It was in England that he witnessed the coronation of his future nemesis, King George III, and he engaged some of the leading businessmen in London. But in 1763, his uncle died, leaving John Hancock with an inheritance of what is said to be the greatest body of wealth in New England. John Hancock returned to this house with fellow patriot Samuel Adams in the spring of 1775. At that time, Reverend Jonas Clark occupied this house. Now, Reverend Clark was all too happy to offer sanctuary because, see, he too was a patriot. In fact, he had preached many times from his pulpit that freedom was a gift from God. The Lexington Minutemen were his parishioners. A war was about to start, and the start of that war could be seen from the windows of this house.
In the shadow of the Lexington Church and Meeting House, the Reverend Jonas Clark, having said goodbye to Samuel Adams and his cousin John Hancock, would have a word with his parishioners, the Colonial Minutemen. As I looked out on the green, I imagined what the moment must have been like.
Dr. Warren and the Committee of Correspondence has sent us the warning. The British are on their way and will be here soon. You have been trained for such a time as this, to stand your ground, to remember your families and your friends as Christians and as brothers. Remember what the Word of God says in the story of Gideon in the book of Judges, that you be mighty men of valor, no matter what comes, even willing to lay down your lives. Remember that from this day will be dated the liberty of the world.
Yes, sometimes I see dead people. Is there a problem with that?
I'm standing right here on Lexington Green, here in Lexington, Massachusetts. This tranquil field played host to the very first military engagement between Great Britain and its 13 colonies on April 19th, 1775. On this village green, the British soldiers and the Colonial Minutemen stood staring at each other for a few moments, tense and alert, neither side sure of what the next few moments would bring. Then Captain Parker uttered a phrase that would be engraved here at the battle site. He said, "Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." Now here's where history gets a little sketchy as to who exactly first fired the shot heard around the world. The British regulars claimed that the shot had come from behind a hedge or from around the corner of a local tavern. Some of the local Lexington militiamen reported that it was a British mounted officer who fired first. Recent speculation has focused on the possibility of an accidental discharge or multiple, possibly unrelated first shots from both sides. One person, a local pastor by the name of Jonas Clark, was absolutely convinced that it was the British who fired first, and later claimed to have received sworn statements by witnesses attesting to that fact. But the important thing to know is that someone fired the first shot, and that shot had monumental consequences.
The first blood drawn in the Revolutionary War was here. Whether accidental or on purpose, it launched an 8-year war in America. It was technically a civil war among Englishmen and a war for independence. The next exchange of gunfire and the first real battle in the war would happen just down the road in Concord. So it was time to get in my sweet Jeep and have a look at the famous bridge where that battle took place. It's a short and pleasant drive through a beautiful and historic countryside. The British mission to arrest John Hancock and Samuel Adams had been foiled. They had escaped. But the other British objective was to destroy the arms and ammunition that the colonists had stockpiled in Concord. The British troops split up. One group went on the search and destroy mission, and the others were told to hold the Concord Bridge so that the British Army would have a safe path to retreat when they were done. Some 500 colonial Minutemen, however, were assembled at the bridge. Smoke was rising from the village of Concord, and tensions were high.
A quick and nasty skirmish broke out, forcing the British regulars to make a hasty retreat back to the village commons. From there, the entire British Army decided that it could only find safety back in Boston. They would spend the rest of the long day in full retreat.
It was a harrowing retreat. What must have seemed like a powerful, unconquerable military force when it left Boston quickly became outmanned and outgunned as thousands of colonials emptied out their farms and fields to defend themselves. They doggedly pursued the British and shot at them all day and from all sides as they retreated to Boston. The British burned buildings and killed a number of innocent people, ensuring that this would be a day that lived in infamy. The battle was publicized by colonists as an example of British brutality, but it was the British that suffered most that day, taking hundreds of casualties.
The most disciplined army in the world at that time had been given a black eye by a bunch of upstart, untrained, and undisciplined amateurs. As future President John Adams said as he was riding his horse along the battle site the next day, "The die has been cast, the Rubicon crossed." Starting that day, militiamen from all over Massachusetts and other New England colonies congregated to lay siege to the British in Boston. The war for American independence had truly begun.
Armed colonists laid siege to the British troops encamped in Boston, and the next battle would be what we now call the Battle of Bunker Hill.
The Battle of Bunker Hill took place on June 17, 1775. General Israel Putnam commanded the Revolutionary forces, and Major General William Howe commanded the British soldiers. Now, while it's technically known as the Battle of Bunker Hill, most of the fighting actually took place on nearby Breed's Hill, over in that direction.
On the night of June 16, 1775, American Colonel William Prescott led 1,500 colonial men onto the high ground of the Charlestown Peninsula. Breed's Hill was viewed as much more defensible, so they decided to build their primary fortifications there. Prescott and his men began digging their fortification with ditches and earthen walls. They worked all night. In the early pre-dawn, the British ship HMS Lively spotted the new fortification and opened fire. Other ships joined in, and soon all 128 guns in the harbor began to fire on the American position, but these broadsides proved largely ineffective because the guns could not be aimed high enough to reach the fortifications. It took the British almost 6 hours to organize an infantry force. General Howe was to lead the major assault, drive around the American left flank, and take them from the rear. Brigadier General Robert Piggott on the British left flank would lead the direct assault. Major John Pitcairn led the flank or reserve force. The British were finally ready to go by 2 p.m. The Americans, seeing all this activity, had also called for reinforcements, but only about 200 soldiers were available. By the time the battle had started, 1,400 defenders faced 2,600 British regulars. The first assaults were met with massed fire at close range and repulsed with heavy British losses. But the inexperienced Americans soon lost military discipline and fought as individuals, each man firing as quickly as he could. The British withdrew almost to their original positions on the peninsula to regroup. The Navy, along with artillery from Copp's Hill on the Boston Peninsula, fired red-hot shots into Charlestown, burning over 400 buildings to the ground. Eventually, the American defenders ran out of ammunition, reducing the battle to a bayonet fight. There was just one small problem. Most of the American muskets did not have bayonets. The British had taken the ground, but at a dreadful cost, with 1,054 soldiers having been shot. Of General Howe's entire officer field staff, he was the only one not shot. The American casualties numbered only 450, and because General Howe's British troops were so exhausted, there was little chance of them advancing on Cambridge and breaking the Americans' siege of Boston.
The British objective in capturing this piece of real estate had been achieved, but the Americans demonstrated that they would fight, stand, and die if and when they were put to the test. These were not merely peasants with pitchforks. After this battle, the first formal battle of the war, the attitude of the British changed significantly. Thomas Gage was soon recalled to England and was replaced by General Howe. Gage's report to the cabinet repeated his earlier warnings that, quote, a large army must at length be employed to reduce these people and would require the hiring of foreign troops.
As we discussed in our episode of Drive-Thru History in Corinth, Greece, the high ground has always been of immense military importance. It's the most easily defended real estate, and it offers the opportunity to let gravity work for you as you rain down destruction on your enemy. Dorchester Heights is the high ground in this part of Boston. Even better, it's within cannon range of Boston Harbor, but not vice versa. In other words, by capturing this key piece of ground, the Americans could lob cannon fire down on the pride of the British fleet that was docked in Boston Harbor, while they lacked the range to fire back.
This keen insight came to a young bookstore owner named Henry Knox. Now, as the owner of the London bookstore here in Boston, Henry had ordered military books for British officers before the war had broken out. In his spare time, well, he read them and learned quite a bit about chucking big hunks of iron great distances.
There was just one problem. Our side was sorely lacking the basic hardware to go toe-to-toe with the British. We needed cannons, big cannons, but we didn't have the ability to manufacture them. What to do? We needed a big, hairy, audacious plan. Henry had one and took it to the new guy in charge, a certain newly installed general named George Washington. Henry's plan was simple in concept, a little more difficult to pull off in the real world. The Americans had actually captured Fort Ticonderoga, and it came with some really sweet British artillery. The only problem? Well, the artillery weighed 120,000 pounds, was over 300 miles away, winter was approaching, he would need to drag the stuff over hill and dale, through rivers, across the Berkshire Mountains, etc., 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 all the while avoiding the enemy.
Washington figured it was a long shot, but he decided to put his trust in Henry. It would be but the first of many high-risk, high-reward gambles that would make Washington perhaps our nation's greatest hero. He peeled off a relatively small amount of cash and sent Henry and some men on an adventure of a lifetime. 300 miles later, they arrived at Fort Ticonderoga. Winter was setting in, and their work had just begun.
On their way back to Boston, Knox and his men averaged approximately 5 miles per day, completing the 300-mile trip in just 56 days between December 5th, 1775 and January 24th, 1776. The cannon train was composed of 59 cannons and mortars and weighed a total of 60 tons.
Now imagine the surprise of the British soldiers who were gently aroused by the sweet music of cannon fire coming from right here on Dorchester Heights. I think the quote from the British General William Howe was something like, yeah, this is not good. or something like that. You see, General Washington had done what the British thought was impossible. He had moved his entire army in the dark of night to this high point. He had installed Henry's new toys, and he had even built extensive fortifications, all before dawn had even broken.
The British had been outmaneuvered, and rather than fight with the Americans, they cut a deal. They would leave Boston without burning it to the ground if they were allowed safe passage. They loaded their ships and departed on St. Patrick's Day in 1776.
That was easy.
The colonies rejoiced at the victory, and the nation had some new heroes. Henry Knox became the father of the American artillery and had a long, illustrious career. Several forts are named after him, including the one that holds all the cha-ching, Fort Knox, Kentucky. The Great Siege of Boston, only partially successful for the Americans, served as the first great act of the Revolutionary War, and it played an important role in the creation of the Continental Army and promoted the unity of the 13 colonies. The role the city of Boston played in the formation of our nation cannot be overstated. The city lives and breathes with the history of America.
Oh. That wasn't on purpose at all. Medic. I'm unplugged.
Prepare to be blown away.